What?
Hello, my name is Adrian Bordage. I'm an executive member with National Citizens Alliance here at the St. John Conference. I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Dr. Ricardo Duchesne, professor at UNBSJ in St. John, New Brunswick. Ricardo is a noted author of this book here, Canada in Decay. Very, very good book, and I have a copy. Haven't gotten through it yet, but I'm hoping to finish it sometime very soon. I have started reading it, and it is a must. For anybody that cares about the future of Canada, this book is a must. It's a great resource of information. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Duchesne. If you could come up now, and he can do his presentation. Mr. Duchesne will be able to take question and answers from you, the audience, and so forth. And he was kind enough to bring some extra copies of his book. So for anybody here excuse me, anybody here that would like a copy, they can see Dr. Duchesne after his presentation. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Duchesne?
Not here, right? You say
Right here.
okay.
Yeah. If you're okay, I can move the podium over. Would you like the podium?
No, I guess that's fine.
Okay, because
Yeah,
we can
as long as you can see me there, fine.
Yes, yeah, I'm going to bring the mic up here. You can hold the mic if you want, or we'll just
okay.
on that. You decide. It's up to yourself.
Okay, hello. Yes, there is the mic. So, hello, my name is Ricardo Duchesne, and I'm gonna make the talk as simple as I can and not keep it too long. What I have here is longer than what I'm gonna talk about, and I'll divide it into some key points. The first one, which you likely know about because it is the first part of the book. The first topic that I'm going to talk about is to simply demonstrate by using a few statistics that the often repeated claim that Canada is a nation of immigrants is not actually true. So what I argue is that there is really no evidence to support this claim. That Canada is a nation of immigrants. Rather, what we have is a situation in which most of the Canadians who came here through the 1600s into the 1700s were born in this soil. If you take just the example of Quebec, and I'll give you a few statistics, from 1608 to 1760, immigration to Canada consisted of 10,000 settlers. So from 1608 to 1760, 10,000 settlers came to what was then called New France. And thereafter, after 1760, there was practically no more immigration. Immigration to New France contributed about only 1/7 of the population growth. Most of the population growth was driven by the high fertility rate of the women that were here in New France. The average number of children that women had in New France was 5.6 surviving children. So you can imagine that those people born in New France were the ones that were creating the population of New France. The same argument can be made about the Acadians. They also had a very high fertility rate. So the whole notion that Acadians are immigrants doesn't make sense. A few of the ancestors of the Acadians came, they were immigrants, but their proportion is very small. So I argue this as well for other areas of Canada. I argue basically when you look at the statistics, you'll find that the people who were living in Canada had a very high fertility rate, and so most of the people in Canada were born in this land. They did not come in as immigrants. And in truth, immigration really started in large numbers, you could say towards the late 1800s. So for example, from 1896 to 1914, Canada did experience a high number of immigrants coming here. There were something like 2.5 to 3 point something million immigrants that arrived during this period, 1896 to 1914. Most of these immigrants came from Britain, and some eventually started coming as well from other lands of Europe. But even through this period and afterwards, Canadians were still having a high fertility rate. So it is not as if the immigrants were the ones who were populating Canada generally across the whole land that we call Canada. So that leads me to the conclusion that Canada was really created by people that are native. You can even call them indigenous to this land. You don't have Acadians anywhere else in the world. You don't have Quebecois anywhere else in the world. And even the Loyalists, they came from one area of British North America to another area of British North America. The other point that I made is that the ones that were immigrants are best described as pioneers and settlers. And there is a big difference between being a settler and being an immigrant. I'll push aside the word pioneer for the moment, just concentrate on settlers. There is a big difference between settler and immigrant. A settler, and I'm using a standard dictionary definition, and I checked many dictionary definitions. If you look at a dictionary definition, it will say that a settler is a person who settles in an area typically with no or few previous inhabitants. Whereas an immigrant is a person who moves to an area that has already been inhabited. They're coming to a ready-made nation. So, following the dictionary definition, you could argue that immigrants only started coming to Canada towards the late 1800s through the 20th century, because at that point, many of them were coming into the cities that were already ready-made. So I think of settlers as coming to a Canada that was still relatively not inhabited, and also you were a farmer. You had to create a farm and small towns and all those things from what were previously very sparsely populated areas. The second major theme of this talk is that the problem with multiculturalism in Canada is that it really recognizes the need of immigrants to have a cultural identity. So multiculturalism as an argument, as a theory, and then as a policy emerged as a way of saying that we should not expect immigrants to assimilate to Canadian culture because they have their own identities, they have their own religions, their own customs. So we should allow them to retain that identity in Canada, although they were expected, of course, to follow the rule of law and to gradually assimilate themselves to liberal values. But multiculturalism still says that human beings are not abstract units isolated from their culture, that they need to have a sense of belonging. So if a person is coming from India or China, well, it should be understood that they still have an attachment to their Chinese history, Chinese background, and we shouldn't compel them to let go of all that background and simply join a Canadian modern society. So that's how multiculturalism came into place intellectually. It was an idea that would recognize the human need to belong in a culture rather than just being some isolated individual. So what I argue basically is that we can use the theory of multiculturalism. Some people find this odd because I don't outright reject multiculturalism, because I do believe that human beings have a need to have a culture, a need to have something greater than themselves, a sense of being connected to their ancestors, to their history, to their people. So the argument I make is that the problem with multiculturalism is that it doesn't recognize the fact that the Euro-Canadians also have that need. The Anglos, the Acadians, the Quebecois, they cannot recognize it for the Quebecois, but that gets into another discussion. But just generally speaking, multiculturalism, the major theories behind this idea, takes it as a given that only minorities, aboriginals, immigrants are in need of having a culture that is their own, at the same time that they are kind of living in Canada and accepting the laws and, you know, the administration and the modern things they find in Canada. So simply I argue, and it's a very logical, common sense argument, that why should Euro-Canadians not be allowed to be concerned about the ways in which mass immigration threatens their own culture, their own ancestry, their symbols. So if only that is added to the theory of multiculturalism, then to me that would be a starting point to have a proper debate. So instead of continuously celebrating the unique cultural traditions of minorities, we would be emphasizing the traditions of the majority culture. So that is the second major point that I make. And then the third point that I make, and I don't want to get into too many details here because it can be a complicated argument. The third point that I make is that Western nations, and Canada is a Western nation, were not founded only on liberal values. There is this assumption that all Western societies, what there is to them, their culture, is just a set of liberal values, a separation of church and state, equality under the law, the right to vote, and that defines Western nations. So I argue, yes, that is something that is unique to the West, liberal values, but there is more to the West. There are also deep cultural attributes that make a person a Western person. And Western nations, when they were founded, when France, England, Germany was created into a nation, they drew from that ancestry, from that history, from those customs, and including their sense of kinship. There is a racial element there as well, the sense of ethnic identity. Like people who sort of say, well, you are Gallic, let's say you're talking about France, you are Gallic or you are British, and that's what makes you a member of this nation. However, because they were also liberal nations, they kind of recognize not everyone is Gallic, and yes, we will accommodate minorities, and we will accommodate people from other ethnic backgrounds. But nevertheless, there was always a sense that we have a core ethnic identity. So then what I argue is I examine the way in which Canada was founded by the fathers during the period of the fathers of Confederation, the arguments that they made. And it is clear to me that when the English and the French came together during Confederation, the English came as a people who understood themselves to be British, who understood themselves to be bringing traditions from Britain, the parliamentary system, the legal system, Christianity as a religion. And the Quebecois was the same thing. And the British at that time, they realized, you know, the Quebecois really are a people, so that we will give them within the Canadian Federation a certain degree of autonomy within Quebec, so that they can have their own representative institution, their own type of civil law that comes from France, and that they can protect their language and have that sense that we are Quebecois. Meanwhile, outside Quebec, we will have that Anglo-British identity, because that's what Canada is, an extension of British culture. So going back to the arguments that were made in favor of confederation, as it was articulated at that time, you can see that Canada as a nation had a strong sense of collective identity. It's not that Canada was viewed as a place where you have abstract individuals who don't have ancestry, don't have ethnicity, don't have a religion, and all they do is they agree to belong to a nation so that they can pursue their happiness and their prosperity and so on. Yes, that's also part of it, because Western nations have been liberal, but there is more to Western nations than liberalism. And this is something that is important to understand, because there is a tension always between liberalism, which emphasizes individual rights, and national identity, which is about collective rights, the rights of a people to maintain themselves as a distinctive people. You cannot understand Quebecois history if you don't understand that. The Quebecois, when they argue continuously against the encroachment of Anglo culture, they don't do so as abstract individuals. They do it as members of a group, of a collective. And they mean to say that we as individuals can only fulfill ourselves as individuals if that Quebecois culture is protected. Of course, they're not like that anymore. The PQ thinks that being Quebecois is just a matter of language. So anybody from anywhere who speaks French, they argue or believe, can just be as Quebecois. So they changed in time, but during Confederation, no, and for many decades thereafter, they have had a very strong sense of collective identity. The fourth main point that I made, and I'll make this point quickly, is that multiculturalism shouldn't be seen as an argument for the rights of minorities. It has been sold that way. Canadians have been told, look, the reason we have multiculturalism is that Canada, throughout its history, has neglected the minority rights of the Aboriginals, the minority rights of these or Jews, the minority rights of blacks, and it is time to recognize them. And multiculturalism recognizes them, recognizes the fact that Aboriginals are a people, they want to protect themselves as a people. Not only do they want equality under the law, they want the right to vote, and they want to be treated fairly and not discriminated, multiculturalism says, but Aboriginals also want to have their own autonomy within their own territories. So people argue that that's all there is to multiculturalism, about recognizing past minorities. So what I argue is that no, eventually, and to this day now, multiculturalism is really an aim to transform Canada completely and give it a multicultural identity by bringing continuous numbers of new immigrants and new minorities. So it's not about recognizing the minorities that were already in Canada. Multiculturalism is seen as a force to reshape Canada in a completely different direction by bringing in more and more minorities who then are given group rights. And the other point to remember is this is not just happening in Canada. This is happening as well in England, in France, in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand. All of them are saying we are multicultural nations. So don't buy the argument that multiculturalism is unique to Canada. It's across the Western world. And they try and get you to accept it by saying, oh, don't you believe in the minority rights of minorities? Don't you think they're equal to you? But that's a very separate argument, because I can say, yes, I think that the Aboriginals that are in Canada and have been in Canada for a long time, they should have equal rights and they should have collective rights. But that doesn't mean I'm going to bring now 1 million Muslims and they too are going to get it. And then I'm going to bring now another group from another nation and another group. and then the Canadian core identity disappears. All right, so that's that fourth point, I think it is. Then the fifth point that I made is that Pierre Trudeau, when he articulated the theory of multiculturalism, he specifically called for the separation of culture from the state. So just as we have separated religion from the state, and what that means is that in a Western country and in Canada, the state cannot dictate and cannot say, oh, the official religion of Canada is Christianity or Protestantism, and people need to become Protestant. You can't do that in a Western state because the church has been separated. So the church is something you go to, but it has no connection to the government. So Trudeau said we need to do the same with culture. The Canadian state should not identify itself as Anglo or British or European. That's a private affair. And the same with the Quebecois, he said. The Quebecois should stop thinking of Quebec as being a place that has an official culture. It doesn't have an official culture. Culture is a matter of individuals' private choices. So you can come to Quebec and say, my culture is Muslim, not Quebecois, or my culture is Chinese, it's not Quebecois. And that's my private decision. And the state is not going to make it official. The only thing that's going to be official is the languages. That English and French are the official languages of Canada. So Pierre Trudeau articulated this separation of state and culture, and what I argue is that this separation he justified on the basis of liberalism. Again, he argued that liberalism is an ideology that cannot allow a state to speak as if it were officially in charge of the common collective culture of a people. That's not liberal, he argued. In fact, he said that when you have a state that says this culture here in this country is Anglo, and we have a strong British lineage, that state is discriminating against other people who are not Anglo and not British. So in his view, that would be undemocratic. And that's why he rejected the Royal Commission, because the Royal Commission was a commission that was looking at Canadians and deciding how they feel about the main culture of Canada. And the conclusion that commission came to was that Canada was actually a bicultural nation. So they came to the conclusion that biculturalism, French and English, were the dominant cultures of this nation. So Trudeau rejected that and said, no, English and French are not the dominant cultures, and any notion in which English or French is seen to be the official notion has to be discarded. The government cannot officially claim any culture as the culture of the nation. So Trudeau then rejected this biculturalism, and then he endorsed multiculturalism and said that Canada would be a multicultural nation. So one of the things I argue, which connects to a previous point I made before, is that when he declared Canada to be multicultural in 1971, he was not talking about Canada as it existed at that time. Because I have no problem if he has said, you know, Canada has Ukrainians, it has Germans, it has Aboriginals, it has Afric in Nova Scotia. So there is some variety of cultures here. I would say, yeah, that is true. Although at the same time, I would still say that the nation is heavily bicultural. Quebecois and Anglo are the dominant cultures. So I would have had no problems if that's what he has said. But in reality, Trudeau was talking about the future. Canada would be made multicultural. And the only way to make it multicultural was to open Canada to immigration from all other areas of the world. So it was really in the 1970s into the 1980s that you actually get immigration coming from outside Europe. in large numbers. And now we know most immigrants are coming from areas outside Europe, and so that's a phenomenon that starts in the 1970s. Then in the sixth part, I think it is, what I argue is that the Charter of Rights of 1982 can be interpreted as a document that set out to identify the main values of Canada with human rights concepts, with values that bespeak for humanity, that are not unique to this nation, but are values that human rights lawyers can articulate in books and they say these are the values of your nation. And that when they conceive the Charter of Rights, they specifically argue that this human rights document, the Charter of Rights, will be used against Canadians who hold the old Anglo-British traditional views which are possibly prejudicial, which do not speak of humanity in general, and could easily, in their view, amount to racist attitudes. So what we see with the Charter is this idea that the Charter is a transformative document, a document that will transform Canada and then finally make Canada a nation of human rights principles, as opposed to being a nation with its own unique Anglo-Quebecois culture. I don't know if this point can be made clear in the fast way that I'm doing, but I don't want to get into all the details that I have here. So I'm just giving you a general overview of Canada, the Charter, being viewed as a human rights document. And so I argue that this Charter, which was seen as a human rights document, that you can actually utilize that Charter for our purposes, because the Charter also has a section 27. In that section 27, it says that the Charter should be interpreted in light of Canada's multicultural character. Because part of the human rights idea, which goes back to multiculturalism, is that ethnic minorities should not be compelled to assimilate, but we should understand that their culture matters to them, and that it is a human right for them to be able to retain aspects of their culture and their customs. So what I argue is that this same section 27 can be used by Euro-Canadians, because the words that are used there are preserve and enhance the multicultural heritage of Canada. Well, the Euro-Canadian heritage is part of that multicultural heritage. So you can say, I wish to maintain it and I wish to enhance it. There is no reason to continuously think that multiculturalism is about other peoples and other minorities. The very logic, the very argument that's behind multiculturalism can be easily used to advance Euro-Canadian interests. And this language, this multicultural language, is written right in the Charter, and it's written right in the Multiculturalism Act of 1988. If you read that act, the words that are used there, well, there are words that we can use, Euro-Canadians can use and say, I as a Canadian should be free to say that I think immigration threatens the culture that matters to me. And it's part of my sense of self, my sense of being a human being, because I'm not just an abstract unit with rights. I'm also a member of an Acadian community, for example. I believe that this Acadian community makes me who I am and gives me a sense of meaning, purpose, and so on. Therefore, I wish to defend it, and I'm going to use multiculturalism to defend it. So that's one of the arguments I make, and I say finally that if you look at immigration trends in Canada, the fact is that as minorities grow and grow and grow, they are going to use the Charter, Section 27, and they're going to use the Multiculturalism Act of 1988 to advance their interests. It is worth knowing that the people who pushed the most for Section 27 were certain minorities in Canada. They really pushed for that. It wasn't the majority Anglo or even the Quebecois. It was the growing minorities in Canada. So as these minorities grow and grow in number, how you interpret Section 27, how you interpret the Multiculturalism Act is going to be deeply affected. Right now, many legal experts, they think it's just a matter of legalistic reading and interpretation. No, the ethnic power of various peoples is going to determine the way that it's interpreted. And if Euro-Canadians think that they're going to survive standing on the sidelines while growing numbers of ethnic minorities say, I wish to retain my culture, I wish to retain the identity of my people, I as a member, say, of the Chinese, as a member of the Koreans, and I'm going to use the Charter to defend it, well, Euro-Canadians are going to have to do the same thing. So demography is going to be the factor that determines this. It's not consulting some lawyer and asking the lawyer, what do these words mean? Because the meaning of those words will depend on the demographic balance of power in Canada. And that really concludes my talk. All right.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you.
Am I still on? Oh, yeah.
We're still live. Dr. Duchesne, would you be able to take some questions from our audience in the room and those that are watching
Yes.
by Facebook?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so anybody here have any questions for Dr. Duchesne?
First of all, thank you for the book. I mean, this is truly something I don't know of any other Canadian authors writing. Most things are geared towards Americans, and so this is truly of value to Canadian, Euro-Canadians. But you talk briefly about Section 27 and also Section 15. I just want to know if you're aware of any current cases before the Supreme Court concerning this.
Not currently, but I do mention some cases in which you can see that they're trying to balance Section 15 and 27. 15 is the one that says that everyone should have equal rights regardless of race, religion, and so on. And so there's always this issue of how do you balance 27, which kind of affirms the collective rights of minorities, with the Section 15 and other sections that affirm the individual rights of Canadians. They seem to be incompatible. But in those cases that I mentioned there in the book, there is a sense in which they came to some sort of compromise. It has to do with religious holidays, it has to do with wearing of clothing, whether a sick person should be able to retain that the head, whatever they wear on the head, as they join the Royal, the Mountie, the RCMP. So there were cases like that, and you sort of get a sense, well, they managed to accommodate both. But one of the arguments I make is this is going to get more and more complicated in time. I have a section on Sharia law in Ontario. During the time that these discussions were going on about Sharia law, which was in 2005 into 2006, they managed to push back this Sharia law effort. But one of the things I said, well, as Muslim numbers grow, you're not going to be able to push back. Look at England now. Sharia law is all over England, and it has to do with the numbers. So to me, it's not just a matter of legalistic interpretation, it's the actual power of various demographic groups. Right now, Euro-Canadians are not even playing, they're on the sidelines, assuming that they're just individuals with rights. But they need to realize that you're not just individuals with rights, but you must affirm your sense of collective identity. Right.
I've got a question from our Facebook audience. one of our supporters, Greg Burke, in Nova Scotia. It's a two-part question. He asks, is it true that Trudeau hated English-speaking Canada, and this was his attempt to destroy Canada's Western culture and values? And second part, or do you want to answer the first part first?
Well, I'll answer that quickly. Yes, that's an important point because usually people think that Trudeau, when he introduced multiculturalism, his main aim was to dilute, break apart Quebec nationalism. But one of the things I argue is that yes, that's true, but because it would make Quebec one culture among many other cultures, and that would happen inside Quebec as well. So some people argue that, but I think, and I kind of said it here a little bit, that he wanted to defeat biculturalism as well. He wanted to defeat a sense of Anglo-nationalism, the sense by the Anglo that outside Quebec, this is my Canada, because this Canada reflects my culture, our links with the Queen, our links with Britain, with the English parliamentary system, English law, and then you can add that song, symbol, language, religion. So he wanted to say, no, you are not privileged to claim this nation as yours. This nation belongs to any culture from all over the world. It's not just yours, which is unprecedented. That has never been done in history. The other thing is that he almost argued, he was not alone, everybody was arguing this, the liberal elites were arguing this, that to be truly liberal, you had to separate culture from the state and make culture a purely private affair. The problem is that Aboriginals were not asked to make it a private affair, and neither were immigrant groups that were coming here. They were given multiculturalism. So when they were given multiculturalism, that means that's not a private affair for you. It means a lot more than that.
Okay, that's great. The second part of Gray's question was, as well, was bilingualism and the metric system part of Trudeau's scheme, given the billions of dollars spent on both, which has not helped Canada's growth on trade and costing Canadians millions on the price of goods?
Yeah, I mean, he wanted to make bilingualism would be the only official thing that the state pays for and promotes. So yeah, in that sense, it would be the only collective cultural attribute besides the legal system. Now you can say, well, isn't the legal system itself a cultural collective part of Canada's identity, of the Euro-Canadians? Yes, it is, but it is at the same time a system that emphasizes above all else individuals and their rights. So it is British, but it emphasizes the individual. So that means it is a legal system for anyone from any race, any ethnicity, and I'm fine with that. But there are other collective cultural attributes that I think are important. For example, the teaching of Canadian history. The saying what I said here, which is that Canada was definitely founded by the Anglo and the Quebecois, and that they were indigenous to this land and they were not immigrants. To me, that's part of a collective narrative that has been thrown to the side. So that has to be brought up to the surface.
Okay. Anybody here? Anybody else here? Donald Duke has a question.
When you talk about multiculturalism, does that not stick in your craw to think that it's separatism? That by promoting this and pushing it and trying to force it down us, our people's throats, is making more of a problem with all these communities by singling each other out, causing more dissent, more anger, more frustration, which is in turn actually causing more trouble?
Yeah, the thing is that multiculturalism is enshrined in the Charter, is enshrined in Canada's Constitution.
If you take same situation, not so much now, but if you were to go back, let's say, during the late 70s, when, let's say, Quebecois were trying to separate, where we were trying to, our government is to try to appease these individuals, and it ended up turning out to be worse. It's a similar situation where Trudeau, his fathers, okay, had to call on the National Guard to straighten this out. Well, that's a taste of what happened back then.
Yes.
Now it's just even worse because he's not just trying to separate Quebec against the English, like the French against the English. Now what he's trying to do is to pit the French against the English, the Japanese, the Asians against the English and the French. He's trying to pit the Muslims against the English, the French, the Chinese. All he's basically is building so much dissent, and it's like divide and conquer. Is that not what he's basically trying to do? It's almost like he's setting this country up so another entity, let's say outside power, like from the United Nations, moves in and says, okay, you, this is going to be it, and you got no choice then.
Yeah. No, I know what you're saying, but the fact is that multiculturalism is based on a certain reality that different ethnic groups do have a sense of identity. Like the Chinese will create a Chinatown and will insist on their language, their culture.
Most cities that you go to, there is Chinatown. Like
Yes.
Vancouver, you got Toronto, you got New York, stuff like that. It's Los Angeles. I understand that, but they've lived together. They've had their issues in the past. They've lived together. But in the last 10 years, it's gone absolutely insane with all this. And it's not just Trudeau. There's other people in the States. There's people in New York.
Yeah,
It's almost like it's a grand conspiracy to try to make everybody all hate each other, fight each other.
Yeah, but it's not. This is not happening because somebody enacted multiculturalism. To me, multiculturalism is a reflection of an actual reality out there.
Yeah.
You have Aboriginals. It follows that their very existence presupposes multiculturalism. You don't create Aboriginals because you advocate multiculturalism. The United States hasn't officially advocated multiculturalism, but it is becoming just as multicultural as Canada. You have large areas in Arizona, in Florida, California, of Mexican Hispanics that have their own neighborhoods. They only speak Spanish. They have their own religion, their own food. They're not going to give you a job if you go there and you can't speak Spanish. So to me, is to accept that reality, but then the Euro-Canadians have to affirm their own heritage and culture and not just their individual rights. Because the problem with Euro-Canadians is they always see themselves as isolated, abstract individuals that don't really have a culture. Because in reality, Anglo culture is very individualistic. So it is difficult for them to see that. Not the Quebecois. The Quebecois have a stronger sense of collectivity.
But there's a vast majority of white people being taught today to hate their culture.
Right.
And that's where we're going wrong in many ways.
Because if you
my father fought for the Second World War. I love this country. Right now, I'm disgusted with what's going on. Okay, what I see. I don't want to see, the French fighting the English. I don't want to see the Asians fighting us. I would like us all to work together in harmony. But I don't want, us little group in one little corner, us little group in another little corner, because all I find that it just breeds dissent. That, to me, is my twist on multiculturalism.
No, I know what you're saying. You're taking the mainstream conservative position. I just don't think it's working. However much they repeat assimilation, assimilating to what? Why would a Muslim assimilate to Canadian culture when that culture is itself celebrating multiculturalism, diversity, Islam, and telling them you can have your own churches, your own ways of living, your own customs, they're just going to assimilate to that. And that's happening across the West. So I feel that right now we're in a situation in which you're going to have to face the reality that you are a group among many other groups. And if you don't identify yourself, your heritage, no one will. They're just going to walk all over it. And simply saying, let's all get together, let's all see ourselves as individuals, they'll play that game, but not among themselves. Among themselves, they know who they are and what they want to be. And so, yes.
Us white people are kind of too laid back, relaxed, and think that, you know, we keep getting the narrative, we cannot have an opinion because being white is a racist.
Right.
I don't believe in that. I don't believe in that. I've been experienced racism from blacks, Asians, I've experienced from Mexicans, I've experienced from Indians, I've experienced from a lot of different ethnic groups. So ignorance and racism it's not just to the white people.
Right.
And that's what frustrates me is our own people trying to silence us from it, pointing at those facts. And you say, us as a white group, we have to start to embrace together. It's so hard when we have so many that are brainwashed now.
Oh yeah, it is very hard. And nevertheless, Trump got elected and their populace getting elected, so arguments that are favoring us are beginning to show up. And Trump is implicitly a cultural nationalist. He's not openly. He defines himself as just a liberal nationalist. But implicitly, I do think he wants America to remain majority of his own race. He wants that. Not because he's a racist, but in the same way that the Japanese wanted to be 100% Japanese, whereas he's not asking for 100%. He's just saying, hold on, we can have some diversity, but there is a limit. There is a point at which we're going to get a lot more divisions. So I think implicitly he is a cultural nationalist, and that we have to ride that train, the Trump train.
Dr. Duchesne, my name is John Savoy. I'm from Quebec, Sherbrooke. And I had a question. Sometimes people need to spell it out to them. With this enactment of multiculturalism here in Canada, in the early onset of the 1970s through here, should Canadian citizens be concerned about the replacement of Euro-Canadians on a greater scale? Meaning that potentially this multiculturalism act will in fact replace us with a significant chance of losing our identity, our way of life, our culture. Should we act now and unite as Euro-Canadians?
Oh yes, like the old English Quebecois thing has to go. That division doesn't matter anymore. The Quebecois understand that. The PQ, they're globalists. It's only about language. But I know many true Quebecois nationalists who realize we are all in this together now. We need to protect the French and the English side, or broadly speaking, the Euro-Canadian culture as a collectivity of people. There are variations and differences within, but it is still a collectivity of people, and they need to defend that. So I think the Quebecois are beginning to realize that that's an old debate that it's not relevant to our times.
Okay, and I have another notion. Quebecois may have had it right when they started to work on a motion or an act to create separatism, to separate from Canada as an entity. Did they see something at that time that the rest of Canada maybe didn't have in line with that value?
No, I think it is the fact that Anglo and Nordic peoples are the most individualistic people. And not in a bad sense, that they really value the choices of individuals as to what kind of customs they want to follow, whether they should be obligated to believe in this religion or that religion. They're very open, and this is all a matter of private decision. whereas the Quebecois had a stronger sense of collective identity. They saw themselves in racial terms throughout their history. And the truth is that the Quebecois are a very homogeneous race. They've been mixing a lot now. But most of them grew up right in that soil. And they don't come from anywhere. They are from there. They're indigenous. The word indigenous applies to them. It applies, in my view, to the Anglos as well. But in the case of the Anglos, you get mixtures of Irish, Scottish, and then Scandinavians who learn English. So it's a bit more difficult to say that. But yeah, I mean, it was really a natural reflection of that greater sense of collective identity that the Quebecois have. That's an identity that I think Euro-Canadians generally need to start expressing.
Okay, so, and I would agree with you. I would agree that the Quebec, or New France, or Quebec, and Portugal have something very unique.
Yeah.
They were much stronger back in the day than they are probably today.
Oh, yeah.
But we as Euro-Canadians, in a combined effort, a united way, should work together and adhere to that general policy that they had back then and become one identity.
Yeah.
As a Canadian, I would say, so we can defend our way of life. Right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Just a reminder for anybody that has a question for Dr. Duchesne, if they could come up close to the phone so that the audience online can hear your question. They can hear the answer, but sometimes they can't hear the question because obviously the acoustics in here are not great, and with all the racket up above there.
Yeah.
And I have, I hope you can take a few more questions. I have a few more online that have questions. First of all, I'll go here. Let's go ahead, John. Yeah, come up here, John. Just close to the phone there if you can. This is John Evans. He's one of our executive members of NCA, and he's one of our good veterans as well.
Do you believe that because of, like I know when I was in the Middle East, we'd get off the boat and they would tell us how to dress and everything else, and the way the females on the ship would dress and everything, and the Canadian government would say, oh yeah, that's the way we're going to do it, let's do it that way. And now they come over here, immigrants, got nothing against immigrants, or people come in, but should they not have to assimilate in some manner as to the way our laws are, the way we live? And like we have our own laws and stuff, so why do they not have to?
No.
It's okay, don't worry about it. We'll take that out of the stores, we'll put this in there just for you people.
The way to understand that is you have to separate assimilation to political liberal values and assimilation to deeper cultural traditions, mannerisms, and folkways. Multiculturalism says that they have to assimilate to the liberal political culture of Canada. You cannot say, well, in Islam we don't have democracy, therefore we shouldn't have democracy here. You can't do that. In Islam, women don't have the right to vote, therefore Muslim women, we will not let them vote. You can't do that. So everyone has to assimilate to the political culture. However, multiculturalism grants them a space within which they can retain other aspects of their culture, their religion for sure, their mosque. And then you get into Sharia law where it starts kind of infringing on here, but they say, no, it's not going to really take away the Canadian legal system. We just need a little bit of more space for our legal issues. So they start kind of infringing there. So my point is that what the Muslims are being allowed here, their cultural space, to feel that they are human beings with a culture, not to feel ashamed of their Islamic traditions, their history. So they're given that space, that is a natural human inclination. I don't think it's right to say to them, just let go of all of it, especially when they're coming in large numbers. They're not going to do it. If they came in smaller numbers, a lot of people could assimilate to this. Like, for example, European white Christians, by and large, assimilated. And they kept their customs at a very lower level in terms of food, few ethnic areas. But by and large, they accepted everything else. They have no problems that the Canadian history was taught in such a way that the Anglos played a bigger role, that the Quebecois were the main people in Quebec. They didn't have a problem with that. So there was assimilation in the past to this political culture and the culture that was the dominant Anglo-Quebecois culture, with a little bit of their own thing, the Portuguese having their own thing, the Greeks their own thing. But now these new people have stronger cultural markers, identities that are not Christian. They never had a liberal democratic tradition. And they have other differences. And multiculturalism says, let them have that, as long as they don't take the political liberal system. And I'm of the view, yes, except that the Euro-Canadians that have this system should realize they also have a culture, a history, ancestry, a kinship, and they have to affirm it. And then let's see who's going to win the game. And they must claim Canada as theirs, and that their culture has majority rights, because we are the majority. Therefore, our anthem, you're not going to start changing it. You're not going to start rewriting the history. You're going to allow symbols of the past in classrooms. All this anti-white, anti-stuff has to stop. So I think that's what they need to do, because constantly telling the Muslims, you just have to assimilate. They're not going to do it. They're not doing it. It's not going to work. So to me, it's Muslims will be Muslims. I mean, and these people will say, you know what, your ways are threatening us, and we're going to cut immigration. You can cut it. So it's not like you're going to let Muslims grow and grow and grow because you are acknowledging that they do have a cultural identity. No, you, the majority Euro-Canadians, can easily say, and we will use the Charter, and we will use the Multiculturalism Act as a way of saying that our identity is being threatened, and we wish to preserve it by cutting immigration in a drastic way. So you can advance that argument. And I think that's the direction it is going to go. I don't see the mainstream conservative assimilation working. You can bring 300,000+ people, and they're continuously expected to assimilate. And what are they assimilating to? I mean, if you're Chinese and you go to Vancouver and you're told, by the way, assimilate to Canadian culture, they're like, yeah, right, I'm going to assimilate to what I see Chinese culture here. So that's what, yeah.
Just another, do you believe we'd be in the mess that we're in now? Because over the last 40+ years, it's been a liberal conservative. If the people had a say in how things were done?
Yeah, it would be different. That's why the establishment has made it practically illegal for these conversations to happen. You can be threatened to be fired. You will be labeled, and that ostracizes you. So they have created a very close, intolerant environment in the name of tolerance, not to allow any discussion. In Gallup poll after Gallup poll, for decades and decades, Canadians have said, we do not want immigration to alter the character of Canada. They repeat it, and the elites, they don't care, they don't listen, they play games.
That's right.
I have a question here from a lady online, her name, Maggie Victoria. Well, her question's preceded with a statement. She says, every time an Anglo tries to define their culture and their identity, they're accused of being racist.
Yeah.
Okay? They're accused of racism. And that they are white nationalists. How can heritage Canadians unite without persecution?
It's going to be very hard. I mean, I think one of the good things about Trump is that he's been called racist and Nazi so many times and blamed for everything that goes wrong, is that this is starting not to have an effect. That eventually a lot of people are going to say, okay, so I was called a racist, big deal. Who else is not called a racist? Millions of people voted for Trump, and they're saying those millions of people are racist, so I guess half the American population is racist. So big deal at that point. So I do think people have to start thinking that way. because the left controls the language, and the left has been really effective in using words so that you never think, like xenophobia. They say you're xenophobic if you don't allow millions of people with very different cultures to come to your land, which is ridiculous, because no other non-Western land allows that. And so the left uses xenophobia, homophobia, you name it, and they want to pretend that it is an irrational fear, when in fact it is a very rational fear that you have, that your neighborhood, which you knew to be a certain way, to look a certain way, suddenly begins to change. And people with very different ways and looks appear and show up. And that kind of makes you feel uneasy. It's a natural, healthy human reaction. Human beings were selected to be in-group oriented. They were selected by nature because it enhances their survival and because it is good. They were selected to be for your group and to be skeptical and ambivalent about out-groups. That doesn't mean you hate out-groups. It just means they're not my group. And I can trade with you. I can even admire the way you do certain things, but you're not my group. So the left acts like, oh, they're xenophobic. And that's why the left doesn't like Darwinian theory at all. They just push that out of every textbook. People are not taught the ideas of Darwin, which are very clear, that many of the habits and customs that we have had throughout history were selected by nature.
Okay, thank you. I have two questions from National Citizens Alliance, Stephen Garvey. He asks, what does controlled opposition mean? And he has a second question, but I'll let you answer the first.
Well, it's a term that people use when someone that appears to be critical, let's say, of multiculturalism and immigration and Islam is not really, because they are still globalists, you can say. So, for example, you could see this with the establishment Republicans in the United States. The establishment Republicans, the moment Trump began to raise questions about immigration and raise criticisms about the effects of masses of Mexicans coming in, because the idea is, oh no, they're doing the jobs you don't want to do, and they work harder than you, and they're really good people, and many of them are. But Trump simply raised an obvious question that not all of them are. There is drugs coming in. So when he did things like that, they really reacted. People that supposedly were conservative, were for America, but they're not. They want a globalized United States. They want to diversify it. The mainstream conservatives, they believe in immigration. You think Andrew Scheer is going to cut immigration? No. He's not going to cut it. During the Harper years, immigration consecutively was at its highest in Canadian history in terms of number of years. In fact, it goes back, as you know, to Mulroney in the late 80s, in early 1990s. That's when the 225 plus immigrant figures began, and it began with the conservatives. So that's controlled opposition, because they appear, when they say a few little things against a few illegal immigrants, you think, oh wow, they're on our side, but they're not.
Stephen's second question is, what is the Canadian deep state?
Well, I haven't thought about that, but I mean, in the case of Trump, what it is that there are many people that have been working in the government administration for years. A government is not replaced because you get a new political party elected and Trump hires a few new people. There are many positions, offices, deep into the bureaucracy that remain there. And these guys tend to be anti-Trump. And then even when he tries to hire someone, where does he go? He has to go to establishment Republican bodies and links and Congress and so on, and that's still deep state. It has links to the past. So I would imagine we have that in Canada, but we don't have a Trump in Canada yet, so.
Okay, I see. Anybody else in the audience have a question? If you do, Just come close to the phone, please.
So in reference to political correctness in your definition, it appears to me that in the onset of the multiculturalism agenda, we could say, maybe this had presented itself as being a means to integrate diverse populations into one society. So with that in mind, because I'm a Euro-Canadian, I was born in Canada, and if I had a thought about something that I disagree with, such as Islam, Sharia law, and I was to mention that in the streets of Toronto, I'd be subject to arrest or detention or fines. So therefore, in my mind, it seems like my freedom of speech is oppressed. So therefore, I'm not able to exercise my rights in this regard. So how do I overcome that collectively? And how do I not become labeled? Because I think I would speak for probably most Canadians. They have these thoughts, but they dare not speak these things for fear of being labeled.
Right. So,
Racist, Dr. Duchesne. Discriminative, these kind of things.
but just to add one point to that, you know, we were talking before about that we should encourage immigrants to assimilate. They're not, and they're not going to. Not only that, it's not only that they're going to have their own little enclave, they are now having an effect even on our liberal freedoms. So it is extending right into the political culture. Never mind just the culture of Canadians that has been suppressed. I mean now the liberal political culture is extending there. And so in Europe, now it is a hate crime to say certain things against Mohammed, against Islam. So you're supposed to just stay quiet and silent. And many people, they knock on their doors after they find stuff they said in Facebook. For example, the rape statistics, they're very high among a certain group of people in England. So if you say that, and you say this is a problem to me, people could say you are just advocating hate of Muslims, and that's not acceptable. So it is getting to that point.
So to me, it sounds like those governments transforming from what appears a democracy, I call it a blue democracy, more swinging to a socialist form of government in this oppressive nature.
Yeah. All right.
I'm thinking so. My thought.
Would the Constitution defend your right to freedom of speech, even if, let's say, M103 were to charge you?
Yeah.
Because you could use that court, and eventually it would have to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because nowhere does it say that you can't ridicule any religion, except for M103. So isn't that in itself discrimination?
Yes, but this is an example of how their power to affect the Constitution is starting to grow.
Yeah.
And many of them can easily appeal to Section 27 and say that section says that liberal rights should be interpreted in light of Canada's multicultural character. And Islam is part of that character, therefore you have to take account of Islam.
Right, in that situation you can't have one's rights supersede another's rights, correct?
Yes.
So in that situation what they're trying to do is supersede my individual rights.
You can say that, yeah.
And why wouldn't I be able to fight that in court of law?
I think that in a sense you have to use multiculturalism yourself.
See, anytime I say or do or anything that has to do with an individual, I'm not going to say another particular, I do by facts, truth, okay? And I will go right to court and I will actually have to say and state that according to the court of law. And I don't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Okay? I'm not going to lie to anybody, but if that's, if they want to label me as a racist and then throw me in jail for that stupidity, for telling the truth of what I know and what I've seen, that's ridiculous.
But it's happening in Germany, in England.
I agree, but
You could even be threatened with disturbing the peace. That what you say may be within your rights.
It's the government strong-arming people to shut up, is what it is.
Yeah.
Take what we tell you to do and just be quiet about it.
I just wanted to add a last point.
Yeah. Would you like some water?
No, that's fine, I
Okay.
think.
We have just one last question.
Oh, one last, okay, I'll take one last
Just
question.
one last question, okay? Do you want to do that?
Dr. Duchesne, this is a question coming off a live Facebook lead. The question is from Sandy Francis. She wants to know what your position on the compact of migration is.
The what?
The compact of migration is the question.
Isn't that the UN deal?
It may be the UN pact, I'm not sure.
The caravan, you mean?
Or just the fact that immigration is a human right.
Oh, okay, right.
Nations without borders.
Right, that these people have grown everywhere. Yes. This goes back to what I said about the charter, which I did it fast and it's not easy to pick up the point. But when you look at some legal experts, what they say about the origins of the charter, they say that the origins of the charter are rooted in human rights concepts that are transnational. So the ideas that are in the charter cannot be traced to Canada alone. They have a transnational character. And speaking to that question, there is this notion now that if you have a charter that advocates fundamental rights and seems to use a language of human rights, a lot of people are saying, well, these are rights for everyone across the world. So if somebody comes in, says, I need to get into your nation, I'm really being discriminated and I'm suffering somewhere else, the person that endorses the Charter of Rights feels we can't reject this person. And that person has a human right as a human being. Even though they're not Canadians, they have that right. That's what's happening with the caravan. The moment they step in American jurisdiction, all these international human rights things kick in, and you have to process them. And they know that's why they're marching that long, because they figure our chances to get in are very high because Western nations are caught up with these human rights principles that apply to everyone.
Thank you very much. Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Dr. Duchesne.
If anybody wants to buy a copy, I can sign it, and they're for $25. You don't have to buy it, but I have a few if you want to get it.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
That when it fell,
Yes.
because it was live, so that's fine. But are you
I can
gonna?
edit it out.
Yeah, like when you put it back.
I better just a sec here. Just give me a sec.